Let me tell you about the 7 nights that changed my entire perspective on death, the afterlife, and what happens to human bodies when no one's watching. I'm talking about my brief but horrifying career as a night shift attendant at the Dallas County Morgue in Texas. If you think working with dead bodies is just about staying calm around corpses, you're dead wrong. What I experienced during those 7 nights in November 2023 still gives me nightmares, and I'll never look at death the same way again. My name is Alex, and at the time I was a 22-year-old college student desperately trying to pay for my final year of pre-med studies at UT Dallas. When I saw the job posting for a part-time morgue attendant position paying $18 an hour for overnight shifts, it seemed like the perfect solution to my financial problems.
The hours were 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights a week, and the job description seemed straightforward. Monitor the facility, maintain proper temperatures for body storage, assist with any emergency intake procedures, and ensure the security of the building and its contents. During my interview with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the chief medical examiner, she was surprisingly honest about the challenges of the position.
"We've had trouble keeping people in this role," she admitted, leaning back in her chair as autumn sunlight filtered through her office window. "The last 3 attendants quit within their first 2 weeks. It's not an easy job, Alex. You'll be alone in this building with anywhere from 15 to 30 bodies on any given night. The silence can be overwhelming, and some people find the isolation disturbing." I assured her that I could handle it. I'd grown up on a ranch in rural Texas where death was a natural part of life, and I'd helped my grandfather process livestock for years. How different could working with human bodies be? Dr. Hendricks studied my face for a long moment before nodding. "The pay is good because we need someone reliable who won't abandon their post. Can you commit to at least a month so we can properly evaluate your performance?" "Absolutely," I replied without hesitation. I needed this job more than she needed to fill the position. My first night was Monday, November 6th, 2023. Dr. Hendricks gave me a comprehensive tour of the facility during the evening shift change. The Dallas County Morgue is housed in a 3-story building that was constructed in the 1970s and renovated in 2018. The basement level contains the main refrigeration units, essentially a large room lined with steel drawers that can hold up to 40 bodies. The first floor houses the examination rooms, administrative offices, and the main entrance. The second floor contains storage, additional office space, and what Dr. Hendricks called the overflow area, a smaller refrigeration unit used during busy periods or when the main unit needed maintenance. "Your primary responsibility is monitoring the refrigeration systems," Dr. Hendricks explained as we stood in the basement, looking at the wall of steel drawers. "These units maintain a constant temperature of 35 degrees Fahrenheit. If any alarm sounds, you need to check the temperature logs and call the emergency maintenance number immediately. Body decomposition accelerates rapidly if the temperature rises above 40 degrees. She handed me a clipboard with temperature logs and a digital thermometer. "You'll check and record temperatures every 2 hours. The logs are also backed up digitally, but we maintain paper records as well. Walk through each floor every hour to ensure security and check for any maintenance issues. The building should be completely silent except for the hum of refrigeration units and the occasional settling sounds typical of older buildings." Dr. Hendricks then showed me the small office where I'd spend most of my shift. It contained a desk, computer, coffee maker, and a security monitor system that displayed feeds from 12 cameras positioned throughout the building. You can study or read during quiet periods, but stay alert. We occasionally receive emergency intakes during overnight hours, though it's rare. If that happens, just follow the protocols in this manual. Let me know in the comments if you've ever worked in a place that felt haunted, because what I experienced on that first night immediately told me this job was going to be unlike anything I'd prepared for. That first Monday night started normally enough. Dr. Hendricks left at 10:15 p.m., and I settled into the office chair to begin my routine. The building felt incredibly quiet, not just silent, but somehow muffled, as if sound itself was being absorbed by the walls. The only noise was the steady humming of the refrigeration systems and the occasional click of the heating system adjusting to maintain comfortable temperatures in the office areas. I spent the first hour familiarizing myself with the temperature monitoring system and reviewing the intake protocols. According to the logs, we currently had 23 bodies in storage, 18 in the main basement unit and 5 in the second floor overflow area. Most were routine cases waiting for autopsies, family arrangements, or transfers to funeral homes. 3 were active medical examiner cases involving suspicious deaths that required detailed forensic examination. My first temperature check at midnight went smoothly. I walked down to the basement, used the digital thermometer to verify the display readings, and recorded everything on the paper logs. The basement was significantly colder than the rest of the building, and I could see my breath as I moved between the refrigeration units. Standing in that room surrounded by steel drawers, each containing a human body, I felt a weight I hadn't anticipated. Not fear exactly, but a profound awareness of mortality that seemed to press down on my shoulders. The second floor check was equally routine. The overflow refrigeration unit was smaller but identical in design to the basement unit. The 5 bodies stored there were all pending transfers to funeral homes, scheduled to be picked up within the next few days. I recorded the temperatures, checked that all drawer latches were properly secured, and headed back to the office. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I first noticed something unusual. I was studying for an anatomy exam when I heard what sounded like a soft, thudding noise coming from somewhere below me. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to make me look up from my textbook. The sound came twice, then stopped. I checked the security monitors, but all the camera feeds showed empty hallways and rooms. I decided to investigate, grabbing my flashlight and keys. The basement was just as I'd left it an hour earlier, cold, quiet, and filled with the steady hum of the refrigeration equipment. I walked slowly along the wall of drawers, listening carefully for any unusual sounds. Nothing seemed out of place. The temperature readings were normal, all the latches were secure, and there were no signs of any mechanical problems. But as I was about to leave, I heard the sound again. 2 soft thuds, like someone gently knocking on a door from the inside. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere in the middle section of the wall, around drawer number 15. I approached slowly, my heart starting to beat faster despite my rational mind telling me that there had to be a logical explanation. Drawer 15 contained the body of a 67-year-old man named Robert Martinez, who had died of a heart attack 3 days earlier. His body was scheduled for pickup by a funeral home the following afternoon. I checked the latch. It was properly secured. I checked the temperature readings again. Everything was normal. I even put my ear close to the drawer, feeling foolish but needing to satisfy my curiosity. Nothing. Complete silence. I stood there for several more minutes, waiting to see if the sound would repeat, but the basement remained quiet except for the mechanical humming. I finally convinced myself that I'd probably heard the building settling, or perhaps air bubbles in the refrigeration system. Old buildings make all kinds of strange noises, especially at night when everything is quiet enough to hear sounds that would normally be masked by daily activity. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills, because the second night was when I realized that what I'd heard wasn't just building noises. I returned to the office and tried to focus on my studying, but I found myself glancing at the security monitors every few minutes, particularly the camera that showed the basement. Everything remained normal for the rest of the shift. I completed my 4 a.m. temperature check without incident, and Dr. Hendricks arrived at 6 a.m. to begin the day shift. When she asked how my first night had gone, I mentioned hearing some unusual sounds but assured her that everything seemed to be functioning properly. "Old buildings talk," she said with an understanding smile. "You'll get used to the sounds. The important thing is that you stayed alert and investigated when something seemed unusual. That's exactly what we need from a night attendant." As I drove home that morning, watching the sun rise over Dallas, I felt proud of having completed my first shift successfully. I'd handled the isolation better than I'd expected, and despite the strange sounds, nothing had actually gone wrong. I was already looking forward to my next shift on Wednesday night, confident that I was going to excel in this position. I had no idea that the strange thudding sounds had been just the beginning, and that by the end of the week, I'd be questioning everything I thought I knew about death and what happens to human consciousness after the body stops functioning. Wednesday night started with an unusual challenge. When I arrived for my 10 p.m. shift, Dr. Hendricks informed me that we'd received 2 emergency intakes during the evening. A 34-year-old woman who had died in a car accident and an elderly man who had passed away at home under suspicious circumstances. Both bodies had been placed in the basement unit, bringing our total to 25. The car accident victim, Jennifer Walsh, is in drawer 8, Dr. Hendricks explained as she gathered her things. The elderly gentleman, Mr. Frank Kowalski, is in drawer 19. Both will require full autopsies tomorrow, so they're tagged as active ME cases. Just monitor everything normally. There's nothing special you need to do tonight. After Dr. Hendricks left, I settled into my routine. The building felt different that night, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The air seemed heavier somehow, and even the familiar humming of the refrigeration system sounded slightly off. Not broken or malfunctioning, just different in a way that made me feel uneasy. My midnight temperature check proceeded normally, though I found myself moving more quickly through the basement than I had on Monday night. Being around 25 bodies instead of 23 shouldn't have made a psychological difference, but somehow it did. The room felt more crowded, more weighted with the presence of death. It was during my 2 a.m. check that things began to get seriously unsettling. Subscribe for more terrifying workplace horror stories, because what happened next made me realize that some jobs expose you to things that science can't explain. Paragraph 2, 2,000 words, Wednesday night, 2 a.m. I was halfway through my temperature readings in the basement when I heard it again, the soft thudding sound that I'd convinced myself was just building noise. But this time, it was different. Instead of 2 thuds, I heard a rhythmic pattern. 3 short knocks followed by a pause, then 3 more knocks. It was coming from drawer 8, Jennifer Walsh, the car accident victim who had been brought in that evening. I stood frozen in the middle of the basement, listening to what sounded unmistakably like someone knocking on the inside of the refrigeration drawer. The knocking continued for about 30 seconds, stopped for nearly a minute, then resumed with the same 3-knock pattern. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Muscle contractions due to rigor mortis, air pressure changes in the refrigeration system, settling of the body on the drawer mechanism. But none of those explanations could account for the rhythmic, purposeful nature of what I was hearing. I approached drawer 8 slowly, my flashlight beam shaking slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. The name tag read, Jennifer Walsh, 34 MVA, in Dr. Hendricks' neat handwriting. According to the intake notes, she had died instantly when her sedan was struck by a drunk driver on I-35. She'd been dead for nearly 12 hours by the time I was hearing these sounds. The knocking stopped as I got closer to the drawer. I waited for several minutes, listening intently, but heard only the mechanical humming of the refrigeration unit. I checked the latch, properly secured. I checked the temperature readings, normal. I even put my hand on the steel surface of the drawer, thinking I might feel vibrations if there were some mechanical explanation for the sounds, but the metal was cold and completely still. I was about to step away when the knocking resumed, and this time it was so clear and distinct that I actually took a step backward. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Then, impossibly, the pattern changed. 5 knocks in rapid succession, a longer pause, then a single forceful knock that seemed to echo through the basement. Let me know in the comments if you want me to investigate this further, because at that moment I faced a choice that would determine whether I kept this job or walked away forever. I should have left right then. Every instinct in my body was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong, that I was experiencing something beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. But I needed this job desperately, and I kept telling myself there had to be a rational explanation. Dead bodies don't knock on refrigerator drawers. It was scientifically impossible. I decided to document what I was hearing. I pulled out my phone and started recording audio, thinking that if I could capture the sounds, I could analyze them later or show them to Dr. Hendricks for her professional opinion. For the next 20 minutes, I stood in that basement recording the intermittent knocking that seemed to be coming from drawer 8. The sounds weren't constant. They would stop for several minutes, then resume with varying patterns and intensities. At one point, the knocking seemed to spread. I heard similar sounds coming from drawer 19, Frank Kowalski, the elderly man who had died under suspicious circumstances. Then drawer 12 joined in with its own rhythmic pattern. Within minutes, it sounded like multiple bodies were trying to communicate through the steel walls of their refrigerated storage units. I played back my phone recording, expecting to hear clear evidence of the knocking sounds, but the audio was almost useless. The recording picked up the ambient noise of the refrigeration equipment, but the knocking sounds were barely audible, certainly not clear enough to convince anyone that something supernatural was happening. It was as if whatever was causing these sounds existed in a frequency range that human ears could detect, but electronic devices couldn't properly capture. By 3 a.m., the knocking had stopped entirely, and the basement returned to its normal, quiet state. I completed my temperature readings with shaking hands, recorded everything in the logs, and retreated to the office upstairs. For the rest of the shift, I found myself staring at the security monitor that showed the basement, half expecting to see the drawers moving or opening on their own. Nothing else happened that night, but when Dr. Hendricks arrived at 6 a.m., I was exhausted and shaken. I debated whether to tell her about the knocking sounds, but ultimately decided to keep quiet. What could I say? That I thought dead bodies were trying to communicate with me? She'd either think I was having a psychological breakdown or that I was making up stories for attention. Thursday night was my next scheduled shift, and I spent the entire day dreading it. I I researched everything I could find about post-mortem muscle contractions, gas expansion in deceased bodies, and mechanical issues that might cause unusual sounds in morgue refrigeration systems. I wanted to arm myself with scientific knowledge that could explain what I'd experienced. I also looked up information about Jennifer Walsh and Frank Kowalski, the two recent intakes whose drawers had been the source of the knocking sounds. Jennifer's death had been covered in local news. She'd been a nurse at Presbyterian Hospital, engaged to be married, with no history of mental illness or unusual circumstances. Frank Kowalski's death was still under investigation, but initial reports suggested he'd died of natural causes, despite being found in unusual circumstances in his apartment. When I arrived for my Thursday night shift, Dr. Hendricks mentioned that Jennifer Walsh's autopsy was scheduled for Friday morning and that Frank Kowalski's would follow on Monday. "Both families are having difficulty with funeral arrangements," she said. "They'll likely be with us for several more days." That night, I approached my duties with a mixture of scientific skepticism and growing dread. I'd convinced myself that what I'd heard on Wednesday was the result of stress, caffeine, and my imagination working overtime in an inherently creepy environment. Dead bodies don't knock on refrigerator drawers, and I was going to prove it to myself by getting through a completely normal shift. My midnight temperature check went smoothly. The basement was quiet except for the familiar mechanical humming. I checked each drawer methodically, recording temperatures and noting that all 25 bodies were properly secured. No unusual sounds, no inexplicable phenomena, just a routine night in a morgue. But at 2 a.m., during my next scheduled check, the knocking returned with a vengeance. This time, it wasn't just drawer 8 and drawer 19. The sounds seemed to be coming from multiple locations throughout the basement, creating a chaotic symphony of rhythmic knocking that filled the entire room. Some drawers produced slow, methodical knocking patterns, while others generated rapid-fire sequences that sounded almost frantic. The noise was so overwhelming that I could barely think clearly. I stood in the center of the basement, surrounded by steel drawers containing 25 human bodies, listening to what sounded like a desperate attempt at communication from beyond death. The knocking continued for nearly 10 minutes, with different drawers joining and leaving the cacophony in what seemed like organized waves. Then, suddenly, complete silence. The abrupt end to the knocking was somehow more disturbing than the sounds themselves. It was as if whatever force had been animating this supernatural symphony had simply decided to stop, leaving me standing alone in the cold basement with my heart pounding and my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because the pattern I noticed next made me realize that this wasn't random phenomenon. Something intelligent was trying to communicate with me. As I stood there in the silence trying to process what had just happened, I began to notice something that chilled me more than the temperature of the room. The knocking patterns hadn't been random. They'd followed a sequence that corresponded to the order in which the bodies had been brought to the morgue. It had started with drawer 8, Jennifer Walsh, who had arrived that evening. Then drawer 19, Frank Kowalski, who had arrived the same day. Then the sounds had moved to drawer 12, which contained a body that had arrived on Tuesday. The pattern continued chronologically, as if the more recently deceased were somehow teaching the others how to make contact with the world of the living. I pulled out the intake logs and compared them to my memory of the knocking sequence. The correlation was undeniable. The bodies were communicating in the order of their arrival, with the newest deaths leading what appeared to be some kind of supernatural orientation process for the older corpses. This realization terrified me more than the knocking itself. It suggested that whatever consciousness remained after death was not only aware of its surroundings, but capable of learning, organizing, and coordinating with other deceased individuals. The morgue wasn't just a storage facility for dead bodies. It was some kind of way station where the recently deceased gathered before moving on to whatever comes next. For the rest of that shift, I avoided the basement entirely, except for the mandatory 4 a.m. temperature check. When I finally forced myself to go downstairs, the basement was completely quiet and normal. I recorded the temperatures with trembling hands and retreated to the office, where I spent the remaining 2 hours of my shift researching everything I could find about near-death experiences, consciousness after death, and paranormal activity in morgues and funeral homes. What I found online didn't comfort me. There were dozens of accounts from morgue workers, funeral directors, and hospital staff describing similar experiences with deceased bodies, exhibiting signs of awareness or attempting communication. Most of these stories were dismissed as folklore or stress-induced hallucinations, but the consistency of the reports was striking. Friday morning, Dr. Hendricks noticed my haggard appearance immediately. "Rough night?" she asked with concern. I was exhausted and barely able to think clearly. Dr. Hendricks, have you ever heard reports of unusual sounds coming from the refrigeration units? Like knocking or tapping noises? She studied my face carefully before answering. Why do you ask? Did you hear something last night? Maybe, I replied cautiously. I'm trying to determine if what I heard was mechanical or something else. Dr. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. Alex, in 30 years of forensic pathology, I've learned that death is not always as final as we like to believe. The human body is incredibly complex, and sometimes biological processes continue for days after what we consider clinical death. Muscle contractions, gas expansion, fluid shifts, these can all cause sounds that might seem supernatural to someone who doesn't understand the science. Her explanation was reasonable and scientific, but something in her tone suggested that she'd encountered similar phenomena herself and wasn't entirely convinced by her own rational explanations. However, she continued, if you're experiencing stress or anxiety that's affecting your ability to work effectively, we should discuss whether this position is right for you. Night shifts in morgues aren't suitable for everyone, and there's no shame in recognizing if the environment is too challenging. I assured her that I could handle the job, and that I was just trying to understand the building's normal sounds. But as I drove home that morning, I knew I was facing a decision. I could quit immediately and find a different way to pay for school, or I could continue working and risk whatever psychological or supernatural consequences might result from prolonged exposure to whatever was happening in that basement. I decided to work through the weekend and see if the phenomena continued. If it got worse, I would quit. If it stopped, I would stay and convince myself that it had all been a temporary psychological reaction to a stressful new job. That decision nearly cost me my sanity. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happened during my weekend shifts, because the deceased had been preparing for something much worse than simple communication. Paragraph 3, 2,000 words. Friday night marked the beginning of what I now realize was the morgue's weekend ritual, a supernatural event that I believe occurs in morgues across the country, but remains hidden because most people aren't brave enough or desperate enough to work consecutive night shifts and witness the full pattern. When I arrived for my Friday shift, the atmosphere in the building felt different immediately. The air was heavier, almost electric, like the feeling before a thunderstorm. Dr. Hendricks had already left for the day, but she'd left me a note indicating that Jennifer Walsh's autopsy had been completed and her body was scheduled for pickup by her family's funeral home on Monday. Frank Kowalski's autopsy was scheduled for first thing Monday morning. We now had 26 bodies in storage, the regular count plus one emergency intake from a motorcycle accident that had occurred that afternoon. The new arrival, a 28-year-old man named David Chen, had been placed in drawer 14. According to the intake notes, he'd been wearing a helmet but had suffered massive internal injuries when his bike was struck by a semi-truck on the Dallas North Tollway. My midnight temperature check revealed nothing unusual, but I noticed that the mechanical humming of the refrigeration units seemed louder than normal, almost aggressive. The basement felt charged with potential energy, like something significant was building toward a climax. It was during my 1 a.m. security walkthrough that I first noticed the smell. As I moved through the first floor, I detected a faint but distinct odor that I couldn't identify. Not the chemical scents of formaldehyde and disinfectant that permeated the building, but something organic and somehow alive. It was strongest near the stairwell leading to the basement, and it grew more intense as I descended the stairs. By the time I reached the basement level, the smell was overwhelming. It was sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water, mixed with something metallic that reminded me of blood. But underneath those recognizable scents was something else, something that my brain kept trying to categorize as the smell of fear, though I knew that was impossible. The basement looked normal under the harsh fluorescent lighting. All drawer latches were secure, temperature readings were within normal ranges, and there were no visible signs of any problems. But the smell continued to intensify, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid the increasingly nauseating odor. As I was checking the final row of drawers, the knocking began. This time, it wasn't the rhythmic, purposeful knocking I'd experienced on previous nights. Instead, it sounded frantic and desperate, like multiple people trapped in small spaces and panic-stricken. The sounds came from at least 8 different drawers simultaneously, creating a chaotic din that echoed off the basement walls. But what made this night different was that the knocking was accompanied by other sounds, muffled voices that seemed to be coming from inside the refrigeration units. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments section, because what I heard next convinced me that consciousness doesn't end when the body dies. The voices were indistinct at first, like people talking in another room with the door closed. But as I stood there listening, some of the words became clear enough to understand. I heard what sounded like Jennifer Walsh's voice calling out, "Help me, I can't move," repeated over and over. From another drawer came a man's voice saying, "Where am I? Where am I?" in increasingly agitated tones. The voice that terrified me most was coming from drawer 14, David Chen, the motorcycle accident victim who had arrived that afternoon. He was screaming, "The truck is coming! The truck is coming!" as if he were reliving the moments before his death in an endless loop. I stood in that basement for nearly 20 minutes, listening to what sounded like 26 dead people crying out in confusion, fear, and desperation. Some seemed to be pleading for help, others were calling for family members, and a few were making sounds that weren't quite human, animal-like moans and howls that suggested suffering beyond anything I could comprehend. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that I was having some kind of psychological breakdown, that the stress of working alone with dead bodies had finally overwhelmed my ability to distinguish reality from hallucination. But the voices were too distinct, too individual, too specific to be products of my imagination. These weren't generic ghost voices from horror movies. They were the actual voices of real people who had died and were somehow still conscious, still aware, still capable of fear and pain. The cacophony continued until exactly 2 a.m., then stopped as abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch. The basement returned to its normal mechanical humming. The overwhelming smell dissipated within minutes, and I was left standing alone with my heart pounding and my hands shaking uncontrollably. I fled to the office upstairs and spent the rest of the shift huddled in the desk chair, staring at the security monitors and trying to process what I'd experienced. Every rational explanation I could think of fell apart under scrutiny. Mass hallucination was possible, I supposed, but the specificity of what I'd heard, Jennifer Walsh's actual voice, David Chen reliving his motorcycle accident, suggested that I was accessing information that my conscious mind shouldn't have possessed. When Dr. Hendricks arrived Saturday morning, I was barely functional. I'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, and the psychological impact of what I'd witnessed was overwhelming. She took one look at me and immediately expressed concern. "Alex, you look terrible. Did something happen last night?" I struggled with how to respond. How do you tell a medical professional that you've been listening to dead people talk? "I think I might be having some kind of stress reaction to the work environment," I said finally. "I've been hearing sounds that I can't explain, and last night was particularly difficult." Dr. Hendricks sat down across from me with a serious expression. "What kinds of sounds?" "Voices," I admitted. "I know how that sounds, but I swear I've been hearing voices coming from the refrigeration units. Not all the time, but frequently enough that I'm starting to question my own sanity." She was quiet for several minutes, studying my face. "Alex, I'm going to tell you something that I don't discuss with most employees, but given what you're experiencing, I think you need to know. In 30 years of working in this facility, I've learned that death is not always the clean, final process that medical science suggests. What you're experiencing is not uncommon among morgue workers, particularly those who work night shifts alone." Her words were both reassuring and terrifying. "Are you saying that dead people actually can communicate?" "I'm saying that human consciousness is more complex than we understand, and that the transition from life to death may not be instantaneous for everyone. Some individuals seem to maintain a level of awareness for days or even weeks after clinical death, particularly if their death was sudden or traumatic." Dr. Hendricks went on to explain that the morgue had a history of supernatural phenomena that stretched back decades. Previous night attendants had reported similar experiences, voices, movement, and other signs of consciousness from deceased individuals. The phenomena seemed to be strongest on weekends and during periods when the morgue was holding bodies that had died under traumatic circumstances. "The important thing," she said, "is that you understand these experiences don't pose any physical danger. Whatever consciousness remains after death seems to be confined to the immediate area around the body. But psychologically, prolonged exposure can be overwhelming. Most people can't handle more than a few weeks of night shifts in this environment." I asked her why she hadn't warned me about this during my interview. "Because most people don't experience anything unusual," she replied. "Some individuals seem to be more sensitive to post-mortem consciousness than others. It appears that you're one of the sensitive ones." Despite her reassurances, I was seriously considering quitting. The idea of returning for my Saturday night shift filled me with dread, but Dr. Hendricks made an offer that convinced me to stay for at least one more night. "I'll stay late tonight and be here for your first few hours," she said. "If what you're experiencing is real, I should be able to witness it myself. And if it's a stress reaction or hallucination, having someone else present might help break the cycle. Let me know if you want a part 2 to this story, because Saturday night revealed the true purpose behind the weekend activities of the dead. Saturday evening, Dr. Hendricks accompanied me through my initial routine, checking temperatures and security systems throughout the building. Everything seemed normal during the first few hours of the shift. The basement was quiet. The smell that had overwhelmed me the previous night was completely absent, and there were no unusual sounds from any of the refrigeration units. By midnight, Dr. Hendricks was beginning to look skeptical about my reports of supernatural activity. "Everything seems perfectly normal," she observed as we completed another temperature check. "Maybe having someone else present is enough to prevent whatever psychological phenomena you've been experiencing." But Dr. Hendricks spoke too soon. At exactly 12:47 a.m., as we were discussing the building's history in the office, every security monitor in the building went black simultaneously. The screens flickered once, twice, then displayed nothing but static. Dr. Hendricks immediately checked the main power systems, but everything appeared to be functioning normally. "That's odd," she muttered, trying to reset the monitor system. "These cameras have independent power supplies. They shouldn't all fail at once." As she worked on the technical problem, I heard it beginning downstairs, the now familiar sound of knocking coming from the basement. But this time it was different. The knocking was louder, more insistent, and it was accompanied by what sounded like metal creaking and straining, as if the drawer latches were being tested from the inside. Dr. Hendricks heard it too. She stopped working on the monitors and looked toward the floor, her face pale in the fluorescent light. "What is that sound?" "That's what I've been trying to tell you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's what happens every night." The knocking grew louder and more frantic. We could hear it clearly through the office floor. Dozens of rhythmic impacts that seemed to be coming from multiple locations in the basement. Dr. Hendricks grabbed a flashlight and headed for the stairs with me close behind. As we descended to the basement level, the smell hit us immediately. That same overwhelming combination of decay, flowers, and something that could only be described as pure terror. Dr. Hendricks stopped on the stairs and covered her nose with her sleeve. "My God, what is that odor?" she gasped. "It gets worse," I warned her. When we reached the basement, the sight that greeted us was beyond anything I had experienced on my previous shifts. The knocking sounds were so loud they echoed off the walls like gunshots. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Several of the drawer fronts were actually moving, not opening, but vibrating violently as if something inside was throwing itself against the steel barriers with tremendous force. Dr. Hendricks stood frozen in the doorway, her flashlight beam dancing across the wall of thrashing refrigeration units. Drawer 8, Jennifer Walsh, was shaking so violently that the entire refrigeration unit was rocking back and forth. Drawer 14, David Chen, was producing a metallic screaming sound as something scraped against the inside of the steel container. "This is impossible," Dr. Hendricks whispered. "Bodies don't have the muscle function to create this kind of movement." But then the voices started, and they were clearer and more distinct than I had ever heard them before. Jennifer Walsh was screaming, "Let me out! Let me out! I can't breathe!" over and over again. David Chen was sobbing and pleading, "Make it stop! Please make the truck stop!" From drawer 19, Frank Kowalski's voice emerged with a message that chilled both of us to the bone. "The new one knows. The new one can hear us. Tell him we're not ready to go. Tell him we don't want to be alone." Dr. Hendricks dropped her flashlight, and it clattered across the basement floor, its beam spinning wildly and casting moving shadows that made the scene even more nightmarish. She was breathing rapidly, on the verge of hyperventilation. 30 years, she gasped. 30 years I've worked with the dead, and I've never seen anything like this." The activity continued for nearly 15 minutes, with more drawers joining the supernatural symphony, until almost every body in the morgue was participating in what could only be described as a mass uprising of the dead. The noise was deafening, the smell was nauseating, and the sight of steel drawers moving on their own defied every law of physics and biology that either of us understood. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The drawers fell still, the voices ceased, the smell dissipated, and the basement returned to its normal, quiet hum. Dr. Hendricks and I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what we had just witnessed together. Comment below what you think was really happening here, because Dr. Hendricks' explanation of what we experienced revealed a terrifying truth about morgues that the public never hears. Dr. Hendricks retrieved her flashlight with trembling hands and methodically checked each drawer. Every latch was secure, every temperature reading was normal, and there were no signs of any mechanical malfunctions. It was as if the supernatural chaos we had just witnessed had never happened. "We need to go upstairs," she said quietly. "We need to talk about what just occurred." Back in the office, Dr. Hendricks sat heavily in her chair and stared at her hands for several minutes before speaking. When she finally looked up at me, her professional composure had cracked, revealing genuine fear underneath. "Alex, what we just experienced is why this position has such a high turnover rate. What I told you earlier about post-mortem consciousness, that was the sanitized version I give to new employees to keep them from panicking. The truth is much more disturbing." She went on to explain that the Dallas County Morgue, like many similar facilities across the country, served as more than just a storage and examination facility for the deceased. According to Dr. Hendricks, certain individuals who die under traumatic or sudden circumstances sometimes become anchored to their physical bodies, unable to move on to whatever comes after death. These anchored souls accumulate in morgues because that's where their bodies are taken, she explained. They're confused, frightened, and desperate to communicate with the living world. Most of the time, their attempts at contact are subtle: sounds, temperature changes, minor electrical disturbances. But when multiple traumatic deaths occur in a short period, and when someone with psychic sensitivity is present to receive their communications, the activity can escalate dramatically. Dr. Hendricks revealed that she had experienced similar phenomena throughout her career, but never as intensely as what we had just witnessed. "Your presence seems to amplify their ability to manifest in the physical world," she said. "You're acting as some kind of conduit or medium, allowing them to express themselves more powerfully than they normally could." The implications of her explanation were terrifying. If what she was saying was true, then my continued presence at the morgue was actually making the supernatural activity stronger, potentially trapping these souls in an increasingly agitated state instead of helping them find peace. "What happens to them?" I asked. "Do they ever move on?" "Eventually," Dr. Hendricks replied, "but the process can take weeks or months, and during that time they can cause significant disturbances. We've had electrical systems fail, refrigeration units malfunction, and in one case, a night attendant suffered a complete nervous breakdown after being exposed to prolonged supernatural activity." She told me about my 3 predecessors who had quit within their first 2 weeks. All had reported similar experiences to mine, and all had left the position after the weekend supernatural escalations became too intense to handle. One had quit without notice after experiencing what he described as a full-scale riot by the dead. "The question now," Dr. Hendricks said, "is whether you can psychologically handle continuing in this position, knowing what you're likely to experience. The pay is high precisely because we need someone who can withstand prolonged exposure to supernatural phenomena. But I won't blame you if you decide this job isn't worth the psychological toll." I spent the rest of Saturday night helping Dr. Hendricks document what we had experienced, writing detailed reports that would be filed away in confidential morgue records that the public would never see. The supernatural activity didn't resume for the remainder of the shift, but I could feel an undercurrent of tension in the building, as if the deceased were waiting for Dr. Hendricks to leave so they could resume their attempts to communicate with me. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happened when I returned for my final night, because Sunday's shift revealed why some jobs are too dangerous for any amount of money. Paragraph 4, 2,000 words. Sunday night was my final shift at the Dallas County Morgue, though I didn't know it when I arrived for work. After what Dr. Hendricks and I had witnessed together on Saturday, I felt a strange mixture of validation and terror. On one hand, I was relieved to know that I wasn't going insane. The supernatural activity was real and had been experienced by multiple people over the years. On the other hand, knowing that I was serving as some kind of psychic amplifier for trapped souls made me question whether I should continue in the position at all. Dr. Hendricks had agreed to let me work Sunday night alone, but with the understanding that I would call her immediately if the supernatural activity became too intense to handle safely. She had also provided me with what she called emergency protocols, procedures for temporarily evacuating the building if the deceased became so agitated that they posed a risk to the integrity of the refrigeration systems or the building's electrical infrastructure. "The most important thing to remember," she had told me before leaving Sunday evening, "is that these souls can't actually harm you physically. Their consciousness is bound to their bodies, and their bodies are secured in the refrigeration units. But they can create enough electrical and mechanical disturbances to make the building dangerous if they become too agitated." When I began my Sunday shift, the morgue felt different than it had on any previous night. The building seemed charged with anticipation, as if something significant was about to happen. We now had 28 bodies in storage. The regular count, plus 2 weekend emergency intakes, an elderly woman who had died in a house fire, and a teenage boy who had drowned in a swimming pool accident. My midnight temperature check went normally, but I noticed that the mechanical humming of the refrigeration units had taken on a different tone. Not quite musical, but rhythmic in a way that suggested coordination rather than random mechanical noise. As I moved through the basement, I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched by dozens of invisible eyes, though I saw nothing unusual. The first major supernatural event of the night occurred at 1:15 a.m. I was in the office reviewing my anatomy notes when every light in the building began flickering in a synchronized pattern. The fluorescent bulbs throughout the morgue pulsed on and off in perfect unison, creating a strobe effect that was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. I checked the electrical panel, but all the circuits appeared to be functioning normally. The flickering continued for nearly 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly, leaving the building in its normal fluorescent brightness. But during those 5 minutes of synchronized lighting, I could hear voices drifting up from the basement. Not the panicked screaming I had heard on previous nights, but what sounded like organized chanting. The voices were speaking in unison, repeating words that I couldn't quite understand, but that seemed to be in English. The cadence was hypnotic, almost like a religious ceremony or ritual incantation. As I listened more carefully, I began to make out individual phrases. Let us speak. Let us remember. Let us warn. When the light stopped flickering and the chanting ceased, I was left with the disturbing realization that the deceased in the morgue had somehow organized themselves into a collective group with a shared purpose. They weren't just random souls trapped by traumatic deaths. They were working together towards some specific goal. I decided to investigate directly. Against every instinct that told me to stay away from the basement, I grabbed my flashlight and headed downstairs. I needed to understand what was happening, and I sensed that this night was going to provide answers to questions I had been afraid to ask. The basement was quiet when I arrived, but the air felt thick with potential energy. As I moved along the wall of refrigeration units, I could feel an intense sense of anticipation radiating from the steel drawers. It was as if 28 deceased individuals were waiting for me to do something specific, though I had no idea what they expected. I stopped in front of drawer 8, Jennifer Walsh, who had been the most vocal during my previous shifts. "Jennifer," I said aloud, feeling foolish but compelled to attempt direct communication. "If you can hear me, I want to help. What do you need me to do?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. Jennifer's voice emerged from the drawer as clearly as if she were standing next to me. "We need you to tell them. Tell the families. Tell them we're still here, still conscious, still afraid. They closed the caskets too soon. They buried us too soon. We're not ready to be alone in the dark." Her words hit me like a physical blow. The implication was horrifying. If these souls were truly conscious and aware after death, then burial or cremation might be traumatic experiences that trapped individuals endured while fully cognizant of what was happening to them. Other voices joined Jennifer's, creating a chorus of desperate pleas that filled the basement. "Tell my wife I can hear her crying. Tell my parents I'm scared of the dark. Tell my children I don't want to leave them. Tell them we're not ready to go." But the most disturbing voice came from David Chen, the motorcycle accident victim. "Tell them about the others. Tell them about the ones who can't speak anymore. Tell them about the ones who've been underground for years, still conscious, still aware, still trapped in the dark with nowhere to go and no way to scream." Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar with your own electronics, because what the deceased revealed next about the true nature of death will haunt you forever. The voices continued for nearly an hour, each soul sharing fragments of their experience of death and the aftermath. What I learned during that conversation challenged everything I thought I knew about mortality and the dying process. According to the deceased, consciousness doesn't end at the moment of clinical death. Instead, it gradually fades over a period that can last weeks, months, or in some cases, years. During this transitional period, individuals remain fully aware of their surroundings, but are unable to interact with the physical world except under specific circumstances, usually when someone with psychic sensitivity is present to serve as a conduit. The morgue served as a temporary gathering place where newly deceased souls could share information and comfort each other before beginning the long process of letting go of physical existence. But some individuals, particularly those who died traumatically or who had strong emotional attachments to the living world, became stuck in this transitional state, unable to move forward, but unable to return to life. The worst part, Jennifer Walsh explained, is that time moves differently when you're dead. Hours feel like days, days feel like years. Every moment of consciousness stretched out indefinitely. And if they bury you or cremate you while you're still aware, you experience every second of it with complete clarity. David Chen's voice added another horrifying detail. Some of us have been dead for decades but are still conscious. There are souls in cemeteries all over the world who are trapped in caskets underground, fully aware but unable to move or speak or scream. They can only wait and hope that eventually their consciousness will fade enough to give them peace. The revelation that death might involve extended periods of conscious suffering while buried underground was more terrifying than any supernatural phenomenon I had experienced during my week at the morgue. The idea that millions of people throughout history might have endured years or decades of aware burial was almost too horrible to contemplate. But the deceased had more to tell me. Frank Kowalski's voice emerged with information that explained why morgue workers experienced such intense supernatural activity. People like you, people who can hear us, are rare. Most humans lose their psychic sensitivity as they age, but a few retain the ability to communicate with the dead. We gather around these individuals because they represent our only chance to send messages to the living world. He explained that morgues, hospitals, and funeral homes often became focal points for supernatural activity because they attracted both deceased souls seeking communication and living individuals with enough psychic sensitivity to serve as conduits. The high turnover rate among morgue night shift workers wasn't just due to the psychological stress of working with dead bodies. It was because these positions consistently attracted people with paranormal sensitivity who became overwhelmed by constant supernatural contact. Every major medical facility has workers who experience what you've been experiencing, Frank continued. But most of them are told they're hallucinating or suffering from stress-induced psychosis. The medical establishment doesn't want to acknowledge that consciousness continues after clinical death because it would fundamentally change how we approach end-of-life care. The conversation with the deceased lasted until nearly 3 a.m. By the time their voices began to fade, I had filled several pages with notes about their experiences and their messages for the living world. But I also realized that I couldn't continue working in an environment where I was constantly bombarded with the desperate pleas of trapped souls. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. Every shift left me exhausted, depressed, and haunted by the knowledge that death might not provide the peaceful rest that most people expected. Instead, it might involve extended periods of conscious suffering that medical science refused to acknowledge or address. As dawn approached and I prepared for Dr. Hendrix's arrival, I made the decision that would end my career at the Dallas County Morgue. I couldn't continue to serve as a conduit for supernatural communication, knowing that each conversation with the deceased was prolonging their suffering by giving them hope for contact with the living world that would ultimately prove futile. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because my final encounter with the deceased revealed why some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. Paragraph 5, 2,000 words. When Dr. Hendrix arrived Monday morning, she found me sitting in the office with pages of handwritten notes spread across the desk and a resignation letter typed on the computer screen. I had spent the final hours of my shift documenting everything the deceased had told me about the nature of consciousness after death. But I had also realized that I couldn't continue to expose myself to information that was fundamentally changing my understanding of human existence in ways that I wasn't equipped to handle. I take it the night didn't go well, Dr. Hendrix said as she surveyed the scattered notes and my obviously distressed state. They talked to me, I replied simply. For hours. They told me things about death and consciousness that I wish I had never learned. Dr. Hendrix sat down and carefully read through my notes, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she finished, she looked up at me with a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. Alex, what you've documented here is consistent with reports from other psychically sensitive morgue workers over the years. You're not the first person to receive these kinds of communications from the deceased, and you won't be the last. But you're also not equipped to handle this level of supernatural contact without proper training and psychological support. She explained that there were specialized researchers who studied post-mortem consciousness, but their work was conducted in controlled environments with extensive safeguards to protect the mental health of participants. Working alone in a morgue without proper preparation or support was essentially conducting uncontrolled paranormal research that could result in severe psychological trauma. The information you've gathered is valuable, she continued, but continuing to expose yourself to these experiences could result in permanent psychological damage. Some people who maintain prolonged contact with trapped souls develop what we call death obsession, a condition where they become so focused on the suffering of the deceased that they lose their ability to engage with normal life. I told Dr. Hendricks about my resignation decision, and she nodded with understanding. I think you're making the right choice. You've lasted longer than most people with your level of sensitivity, and you've gathered more detailed information about post-mortem consciousness than any previous employee. But the psychological cost is too high to continue. However, Dr. Hendricks made a request that complicated my departure from the morgue. She asked if I would be willing to share my experiences with a research team that studied paranormal phenomena in medical facilities. According to her, there were legitimate scientists who were working to understand the mechanisms behind post-mortem consciousness, and my detailed accounts could contribute to research that might eventually help both the living and the dead. The deceased told you that consciousness continues after clinical death, sometimes for extended periods, she said. If that's true, then medical science needs to acknowledge this reality and develop protocols for minimizing post-mortem suffering. Your experiences could be the foundation for research that fundamentally changes how we approach death and dying. The idea that my traumatic week at the morgue could contribute to scientific understanding that might help trapped souls find peace was appealing, but I was also reluctant to relive the experiences by discussing them with researchers. The psychological impact of my conversations with the deceased had left me feeling depressed and anxious, with a persistent fear of death that was affecting my daily life. After much consideration, I agreed to participate in one interview with Dr. Hendricks' research contacts with the understanding that I would not be asked to return to the morgue or to expose myself to further supernatural phenomena. The interview was conducted the following week at a university research facility where I spent 4 hours describing my experiences to a team of psychologists, paranormal researchers, and medical professionals. The research team was particularly interested in the deceased's claims about the duration of post-mortem consciousness and their descriptions of the experience of being buried while still aware. According to one of the researchers, similar reports had been collected from psychically sensitive individuals at morgues, hospitals, and funeral homes across the country, but the consistency of these accounts had never been properly documented. What you've described matches reports we've received from dozens of other individuals, the lead researcher explained. The deceased consistently report that consciousness fades gradually rather than ending abruptly at clinical death, and they frequently express distress about burial or cremation procedures that occur while they're still aware of their surroundings. The research team was working on developing protocols that could be implemented in morgues and funeral homes to minimize potential post-mortem suffering. These included extended waiting periods before burial or cremation, environmental modifications to reduce distressing stimuli for potentially conscious deceased individuals, and training programs for morgue workers to recognize and respond to signs of supernatural activity. But the researchers also emphasized that much more work needed to be done before these protocols could be widely implemented. The medical establishment was resistant to acknowledging post-mortem consciousness because it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of death and would require significant changes to established practices. Your experiences represent valuable data, one researcher told me, but they're also just one piece of a much larger puzzle. We need hundreds of similar accounts from psychically sensitive individuals before we can convince the medical community to take this phenomenon seriously. The interview process was psychologically difficult, as reliving my experiences with the deceased brought back all the emotional impact of those conversations. By the time it was over, I was even more convinced that I had made the right decision in leaving the morgue position. In the months that followed my resignation, I struggled with the psychological aftermath of my week working with the dead. The knowledge that death might involve extended periods of conscious suffering made it difficult for me to function normally in daily life. I found myself obsessing over the fate of deceased individuals, wondering whether people I had known who had died were still conscious and suffering somewhere beyond the reach of the living world. I eventually sought counseling to help process the trauma of my experiences. The therapist I worked with specialized in helping individuals who had been exposed to supernatural phenomena, and she helped me develop coping strategies for dealing with the existential anxiety that had resulted from my conversations with the deceased. What you experienced at the morgue has given you knowledge about death that most people don't possess, she explained during one of our sessions. That knowledge is both a burden and a responsibility. You can't unknow what you've learned, but you can choose how to use that information in a way that doesn't destroy your ability to live a normal life. Through therapy, I learned to compartmentalize my knowledge about post-mortem consciousness while still honoring the experiences I had shared with the deceased. I continued to hope that the research team would eventually develop protocols that could help trapped souls find peace, but I also accepted that I couldn't personally solve the problem of post-mortem suffering. Let me know in the comments if you want me to share more about how to protect yourself from supernatural workplace experiences, because what I learned about the prevalence of these phenomena will change how you view every medical facility you enter. One of the most disturbing revelations from my research interview was the discovery that supernatural activity in medical facilities is far more common than most people realize. According to the research team, virtually every major hospital, morgue, and funeral home has staff members who report paranormal experiences. But these accounts are typically dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations or attention-seeking behavior. The medical establishment has a strong bias against acknowledging supernatural phenomena, one researcher explained, because it challenges the scientific materialism that forms the foundation of modern medicine. Doctors and administrators would rather attribute paranormal reports to psychological problems than consider the possibility that consciousness might continue after clinical death. This systematic dismissal of supernatural experiences means that thousands of medical workers are left to cope with paranormal encounters without institutional support or acknowledgement. Many develop psychological problems similar to what I experienced, but they're often told that their difficulties are due to job stress rather than exposure to genuine supernatural phenomena. The research team estimated that approximately 5% of the population possesses enough psychic sensitivity to regularly experience supernatural contact, but most of these individuals learn to suppress their abilities to avoid being labeled as mentally unstable. Those who work in medical facilities often find their sensitivity amplified by constant exposure to death and dying, resulting in increasingly intense paranormal experiences that can become psychologically overwhelming. People like you represent an untapped resource for understanding post-mortem consciousness, another researcher told me. But they also represent a vulnerable population that needs protection from the psychological trauma that can result from uncontrolled supernatural contact. The research team was working to develop support networks for psychically sensitive medical workers, including counseling resources and protocols for managing supernatural experiences in workplace environments. But progress was slow due to resistance from medical administrators who preferred to maintain the official position that paranormal phenomena don't exist. As I reflect on my week working at the Dallas County Morgue, I'm struck by the contrast between what I experienced and what the general public believes about death and dying. Most people assume that death is a peaceful transition to whatever comes next. But my conversations with the deceased revealed a much more complex and potentially traumatic reality. If the souls I spoke with were telling the truth, then millions of people throughout history have experienced extended periods of conscious suffering after clinical death, trapped in bodies that no longer function, but minds that remain painfully aware. The implications for how we approach end-of-life care, funeral practices, and grief counseling are staggering. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of my experience was the realization that this knowledge exists in isolated pockets throughout the medical community, possessed by individuals who have had similar supernatural encounters, but who are unable to share their experiences without risking their professional credibility. The institutional denial of post-mortem consciousness means that potentially valuable information about death and dying is being systematically suppressed. I still think about the deceased individuals I spoke with during my week at the morgue. Jennifer Walsh, who was terrified of being buried while still conscious. David Chen, who was trapped in an endless loop of reliving his motorcycle accident. Frank Kowalski, who had been dead for weeks but was still aware and desperate for contact with the living world. I wonder if they eventually found peace, or if they're still trapped in that transitional state between life and death, waiting for someone else with psychic sensitivity to serve as their conduit to the living world. The knowledge that they might still be suffering is a burden I carry with me every day. My experience working the night shift at a haunted morgue taught me that death is not the simple, final process that most of us assume it to be. Instead, it might be the beginning of a complex and potentially traumatic experience that we're only beginning to understand. The deceased are trying to tell us something important about the nature of consciousness and mortality, but we're not listening. Until the medical community acknowledges the reality of post-mortem consciousness and develops protocols for minimizing post-mortem suffering, people like me will continue to serve as unofficial bridges between the world of the living and the dead. But the psychological cost of this role is enormous, and most of us aren't equipped to handle it without proper support and preparation. If you work in a medical facility and have experienced unexplained phenomena, know that you're not alone and you're not losing your mind. What you're experiencing might be genuine contact with consciousness that continues after clinical death, but also know that prolonged exposure to these phenomena can be psychologically damaging, and you should seek professional help if the experiences become overwhelming. The dead are trying to tell us something important about the nature of existence, but listening to their messages comes with a price that few people are prepared to pay. My week at the Dallas County Morgue convinced me that some jobs expose us to realities that we're not meant to handle alone, and that the boundary between life and death is far more complex and permeable than we've been taught to believe. Remember that every medical facility you enter might be home to souls who are trapped between worlds, desperate for acknowledgement and communication, but unable to reach across the barrier that separates the living from the dead. They're not trying to frighten us. They're trying to warn us about what awaits us all on the other side of clinical death. The bodies in morgues don't stay still because the consciousness within them refuses to accept that their time in the physical world has ended. They're fighting against the transition to whatever comes next, clinging to awareness and identity, even as their bodies decay around them. That's the truth I learned during my 7 nights working with the dead, and it's a truth that will haunt me for the rest of my life.